Remember that old television program, that sitcom, The Jeffersons? One of my favorite characters on The Jeffersons was the Jeffersons' maid, Florence. Florence was a maid who didn't behave like a maid. She didn't do anything she was told. She wouldn't answer the phone. She wouldn't answer the door. She talked back to George. She even insulted George. She was funny because she met none of the expectations of a maid. She did nothing she was supposed to do. Sometimes we Christians forget that we are servants, The New Testament word that's translated servants is actually doulos, which means slave. We are slaves. And yet we almost are like Florence. We forget that we're called to be servants. And so our prayer life becomes curiously one-sided. It's all about asking God to do us favors. And when we forget that we're to be servants, we forget the place of the church within the larger community. Our place in the community is to offer service, especially to those beyond our walls. The joy that we experience in the Christian life isn't outside the bonds of being servants. It is voluntary servitude, but it is servitude. Jesus said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his soul as a ransom for many." And he calls us to follow him in being servants as well. Let me read the last couple verses of that text from a different version, the Revised Standard Version. Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that is commanded you, say, "We are unworthy servants. We've only done what was our duty." Duty is a word that's fallen out of favor. The word was very important in the Victorian era. To us, it connotes blind obedience and unthinking assent, and is seen by many as a morally inferior motive. Superior motives are love, compassion, and joy. But what about those times when we don't feel love, compassion, and joy in our heart? What are we supposed to do then? That's when we exercise our sense of duty. When our youngest child was born, I was 37 years old, and I took turns getting up with Elizabeth in the night, and many of those nights I actually enjoyed getting up and spending a little time with the baby. But then there were other times I really didn't want to roll out of bed and go through the hassle of taking care of her in the middle of the night. But you know what? I did, because it was my duty. Didn't always want to, but I did because it was my duty. Duty is really a more important part of our lives than we would admit. The duty of students is to study. The duty of workers is to work. I wonder how many doctors and nurses on a cold winter day would prefer to stay in the warmth of their home as opposed to going to the hospital for their shift. They're doing their duty. M. Scott Peck, in one of his books, talks about a patient he had that he found absolutely repulsive. But he refused to refer him, and he says, out of a sense of duty, he served him, and it was out of that sense of duty that came healing for that person. In the Christian life, we're sometimes acting like Florence on the Jeffersons. We refuse to serve. As the text says, we get weary as servants. We want to stop serving before the master's been served supper. Our compassion wears out. We grow impatient with the ethical demands of our discipleship. But duty is important. Now, the call to duty seems like something quaint. As I said, it's sometimes seen as an inferior motivation, but I have learned from a Christian example in my life the importance of duty. There was a man in my home church named Ernie Bond. He was born in 1897 and he died in 1995. You can see he lived a very long life. He was born in England, and he can remember in 1901 when the news came to their cottage that Queen Victoria had died. And Ernie's comment on that was, "And nothing has been right since." Ernie was a Victorian. He had a sense of duty that motivated his life around his responsibilities to his family, his responsibilities to the country, his responsibilities to be a moral person, his responsibilities to his church. He ordered his life around a sense of duty, and it was because he ordered his life around a sense of duty that he found a peace that passes all understanding. Now, we have negative feelings about duty because it connotes blind obedience, people saying, I just was following orders. But the reality is, in our society, that duty as a concept has been replaced by other values. And the primary value that has been replaced with is the tyranny of our own desires. The tyranny of our own desires. We feel an obligation to ourselves that takes precedence over all other obligations. Whereas previous generations talked about self-sacrifice, we talk about self-fulfillment. I read an interesting story about a psychiatrist who was working with a patient, and this was a young woman in her 20s. She complained that she'd become nervous and fretful because life was so hectic. There were too many big weekends, too many discos, too many late hours, too much talk, too much wine, too much pot, too much of everything. And the therapist mildly said to her, well, why don't you stop? And she got this blank look on her face, and then all of a sudden lit up with a moment of illumination and said, you mean I don't really have to do what I want to do? That's somebody who's driven by a sense of self-fulfillment. You know, if we walk into a smorgasbord and think that we can eat everything, we become an obese person physically. Many people have treated the smorgasbord of their desires as something that they have no limits on, and so we become obese in spirit. And it affects every area of our society, even the army. Those of you who can remember World War II, remember the recruiting poster? Uncle Sam was pointing his bony finger and saying, I want you. Out of a sense of duty, you sign up for the military. And then later on, the Army began to say, be all that you can be. Remember that? That's moving from duty to self-fulfillment. And finally, we wound up just being an army of one. Jesus said that you find yourself when you deny yourself. You find life when you give up your life for others and for the sake of the gospel. That's what we sang in the hymn. Jesus washed his disciples' feet, and that's the way we're supposed to approach our world as well. Now, our sense of duty is often bound up with covenant relationships, obligations that are related to the covenants we make. Someone said that when we make covenants, we enter into covenants when we are strong, so that when we're weak, we're bound by that covenant. I doubt that there is a single couple that I marry while they're taking their vows and say, in sickness and in health, imagine that they're going to become the caregiver for the person they're marrying. But our covenant binds us to do that. I doubt there's a parent who stares through the glass in the OB section of the hospital and looks at that new baby that imagines part of the covenant they're entering into with that child is to show up at the principal's office when they've done something bad, to show up at the police station when they've done something illegal, to show up at the detox center when they've got big trouble. But that's part of the duty we have as a part of our covenants. Now, we have a relationship with God, a covenant relationship with God, but it's not a relationship of equals. We are to be the servants in that covenant, not behave like Florence on the Jeffersons. We're told in the gospel that Reverend Black read that we're to take up our cross and follow him. Now, it is true that it's best if we use the right motives to to produce the right actions, but we need to follow right actions whether or not we feel motivated. John Wesley got a letter from one of his young preachers who said, "I think I'm losing my faith." And John Wesley didn't say, "Well, take a little time for yourself until you get yourself together and then maybe you can preach." John Wesley said, "If you don't think you've got faith, preach faith until you have it. Preach faith until you have it." The blessing comes at times not in doing what we want to do, but in what we ought to do. And this affects pastors just like everybody else. There have been times when I would have preferred to watch the ninth inning of a baseball game rather than responding to a call at the hospital. But you know what I've discovered over the time I've been a pastor? It's often in fulfilling our duty, even when we don't want to, that is when we receive the blessing. That's when we receive the blessing, just because we do our duty. And so if you're a parent, there will be a blessing if you do your duty and help the child rather than go out and play golf. And if you are connected to someone else in a marriage covenant, the blessing comes at times by honoring the commitment when it's least convenient to do so. We have many covenants we enter into as a part of our society, as a part of our families, and we enter into covenants when we become a member of a spiritual community. And the little card with your Lenten commitments share the items that are a part of our specific covenant together, to be in worship together so that we are formed by God's word and the songs and the prayers, to be in service, to be praying constantly, to be committed to extravagant generosity, and to witness to our faith. Now, what is the reward if we do what we are required? The text says that the reward is that we do our Master's will. Duty is a word we need to rediscover if we want to be more than just shallow disciples. 2 verses before the text I read for you, Jesus' disciples beg him, "Increase our faith." And he tells them this story in response. As Wesley said, preach until you have faith. Do your duty when it's all you can do, even if you don't feel motivated. Don't be like Florence on the Jeffersons. Now, the hardest part of this text is in verses 9 and 10. So you also, when you've done all that is commanded of you, say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." You know, we want our reward in our annual performance review with God. As Christians, we want good marks. We don't want to feel like we're unworthy servants, but we are, because we're imperfect in our service and incomplete in our obedience. But there's something that makes all the difference. Our value as servants comes not from ourselves, but from the one we serve. God doesn't love us because we are worthy. We are worthy because God loves us. That's what makes service possible.